So, the true crime story we'll talk about today, it's complete 100% drama, which I'd be lying if I said I'm not here for it all the way, because I am. But it also just shows you how low people can stoop and just how petty things can get sometimes. Now, no one was killed or murdered or injured, hurt in any way in this story. But it's still a true crime story. Criminal actions took place, and I was fascinated by it. So I want to tell you about Kelly Peters. Now, I've got lots of notes so that I make sure to get every detail correct. Kelly Peters is a PTA mom from Irvine, California. She was the PTA president. All the parents knew her and liked her. She's known for wearing bright colors, and she's got kind of a hippie vibe. She wears a lot of peace signs and tie-dye and things like that. And Kelly was quite popular at this school, not only with the children, but with the staff and the parents alike. She was just well liked. And that led to her becoming PTA president. She ran a program on Wednesday afternoons, and it was an after-school program called ACE, which stands for Afternoon Classroom Enrichment. So different programs would happen on Wednesday afternoons. For example, it may be a sport or maybe learning an instrument. So Kelly's own daughter, Sydney, was a student at Plaza Vista, it's the school, and she had attended for kindergarten through 5th grade. So Kelly had become a volunteer after leaving a job in the mortgage industry, which she said just took her soul out, basically. She found it to be a lot of stress, and once she got pregnant and decided to have kids, she decided that was done. She was done with that. Now, she wanted to focus on raising her daughter. She had struggled to get pregnant. It took her and her husband quite some time to get pregnant. So once she had a child, that was her priority. So she and her husband, Bill, moved to Irvine. Now, if you don't know anything about Irvine, California, it's been ranked the safest city for its size consistently over some years. The houses all look the same. The lawns, the mailboxes, and the neighborhood layouts are very cookie cutter even. And Kelly was drawn to this. It was kind of like it represented safety for her. One thing she loved was the focus on academics and the great schools. And supposedly, Irvine schools claim a 97% college admission rate. So Kelly, she wanted to raise a child there with great schools in a cookie cutter, safe neighborhood. And I think a lot of moms can relate to that. She felt right at home at this Plaza Vista Elementary. Like I mentioned, she was very well known at the school. Not every parent volunteer has their own desk in the office, but Kelly did. They made room for her, and even though it was a volunteer and unpaid position, they still made her feel welcome as though she worked there. And she was at the school constantly. So our story opens up on Wednesday, February 16th, 2011. Kelly got a text from the karate instructor that day. It was afternoon, and the school program was about to start, and today it was karate, and the karate teacher was running late. So he sent her a text. Could she please get his class ready? That would consist of her going in and helping them stretch and warm up and get ready for their karate movements, whatever they do. And so a staff member walked down to where Kelly was helping them stretch and tapped on the glass and said, "You've got a visitor. There's a policeman at your desk." And immediately Kelly goes into panic mode because her husband is a traveling salesman. He's on the road a lot, and she's feared things like this. She doesn't want to get that dreaded visit that something happened on the road to her husband. So she's in a panic, and she makes it to her office and starts to panic and asks the officer, "What is it? Is my husband okay?" And he tells her, "Yes, calm down. It's not your husband. It's nothing to do with that." So the officer led Kelly out into the parking lot and calmly explained to her that a phone call had been placed, that she had been driving recklessly in the parking lot about 1:15 p.m. So she knew she had been at the school since 12:40 and wasn't driving recklessly. So she let the officer know that her car had been parked at that time. There must have been some misunderstanding, and she was sorry, but that wasn't her. And the officer at that time asks if he can search her vehicle. And Kelly agrees to this. "Absolutely, you can search my vehicle. There's nothing in it."
There's nothing in it. There's nothing in it.
In fact, the officer specifically asked if Kelly had anything in the car that she might not want him to see. And she immediately says, "No, go right ahead." And so the officer does. And the minute that he gets into her car, he sees the back side of the driver's side where the little pouch is, where you stick things. It had a large bag of marijuana hanging out of it. Plain as day in the middle of the day. And so he finds that, which was 17 grams of marijuana, to be exact, in a Ziploc bag. There was a pill pouch containing 29 Vicodin, and inside the bag of marijuana there was a ceramic pipe just sitting in the bag. So Kelly sees this as he's pulling it out, and she drops to her knees and starts to sob, basically, and say, "It's not mine." She says, "It could have been planted in my car. I leave my car door open sometimes. I'm at a school. It's unlocked if she's in a hurry and whatever." And at this point, the officer has enough to arrest Kelly. He's got the drugs right here. She allowed him to search the car, so he can take her in right at this moment. He's actually 7 hours into his shift, and, it's been a long day. A long day of basically answering noise complaints and, some of the smaller crimes that happen in an area like Irvine. Now, instead of taking her in, he performs a field sobriety test, and she passes it with flying colors. And he asks her co-workers if she was parked there at 1:15 when the call came in, and they all say yes, that she was there at 12:40. So Officer Charles Shaver was a former NCIS officer. He was an investigator for the Marines, and he was a sniper and had worked on the Irvine police force for 22 years and never once had to fire his weapon. But one thing he had seen in 20 years was plenty of drug busts. And as I'm sure most of us are not too surprised to hear that it's never their drugs, right? Deny it until the very end. Those aren't even my pants. I was holding it for someone. It's never their drugs. But in Kelly's case, the officer's spidey senses were just lit up, and something was fishy. It just wasn't right. No drug bust had ever come that easy for him. He smelled a rat, and he wanted to investigate it further. And sometime during this whole fiasco, Kelly's daughter gets out of school for the day. She's in the parking lot. She calls her husband, and he immediately arrives. And the officer tells Kelly she can go home, but that they're going to run a DNA test on that marijuana pouch and on the Percocet pouch. And if her DNA is on that, she's not off the hook completely. And she was terrified. Now, one final thing that Officer Shaver wanted to do before letting her go was to look through her home. And he asked her Is she okay with him searching her home? She immediately says yes, but now in retrospect she says that she was terrified because if someone could have planted something in her car, certainly they could have planted something in her home as well, and she had no idea what had happened, so that was a big possibility in her eyes. But she thought, what choice do I have? And so she allowed the officer to search her home, and he found nothing at all. And he ultimately took cheek swabs from Kelly and from Sydney, her daughter, just in case they could have been Sydney's drugs, because they were open to all possibilities at that point. So before the officer left for the day, he had one final question for her. How did she think that the drugs got in her car? And her answer was simply, I have an enemy. Okay, so let's rewind back a minute. Almost exactly 1 year to the day prior to where our story opened. This was February 17th of 2010. It was also a Wednesday. And today, instead of karate being the after school, this was tennis. And there was a tennis instructor that met with the children at the courts behind the school in the back. And after class, all of the children would gather and walk up to the front to meet their parents. Well, one of Kelly's main priorities was rounding up the children, bringing them up to the sidewalk to meet with their parents. On this particular day, the tennis instructor noticed a boy at the back door trying to get in, and he was locked out. The tennis instructor walked the boy up to the front, and as they get to the front desk in the office, the boy sees his mother, and his mother's name is Jill Easter. Jill came into the school after waiting for her son outside, and as she came in, she saw Kelly coming in with other children. So at this moment, her son approaches with the tennis instructor, and she's a bit confused about what has gone on, and she starts to ask questions of Kelly. Why was the tennis instructor walking him up? Wasn't that unusual? And Kelly replied to her that it wasn't unusual at all for the tennis instructor to walk children up, that lots of instructors would walk up with children sometimes. Jill told Kelly that her son was very upset and she wanted answers. What had happened? And Kelly replied in a way that I'm sure now looking back, she wishes she hadn't. She said to Jill that it wasn't a big deal. He was probably just slow to line up, and that he sometimes was a daydreamer and took his time getting in line, and that she had not noticed that he wasn't in the line that day. This did not sit well with Jill. At the moment, Kelly says, she didn't notice any animosity or anger. She said that she gave the boy a hug and that his mother seemed fine. All was well, and they went about their day. Well, it appears all was not well, at least not with Jill Easter. She wasn't happy about the situation. As they passed in the hall when they were leaving, Jill turned to Kelly and said, I hope you can sleep at night the way you treat people. And this just flabbergasted Kelly. She really liked the boy and didn't intend to pick on him, and she really didn't notice that he hadn't lined up. And to have a parent snap at her, I think, was really unusual. I don't think it had ever happened to her before. She was so well liked, and so she went into the office and cried. It hurt her feelings. I think she was a little sensitive about it, especially when it came to children, because she loves kids. So a little bit about Jill Easter. She and her husband, Kent Easter, were both pretty high-powered attorneys. He went to UCLA and Stanford, and she went to Berkeley. Now, she decided to become a stay-at-home mom for their 3 kids, and he worked in Newport Beach at one of the top biggest firms there in Orange County, and he was said to have been making about $400,000 a year. And so they were pretty well off, and they were considered, I guess, some of the social elite, and especially in their own eyes, they definitely were. And I think especially in Jill's eyes, they were. So the following morning, after this occurred, that Thursday morning in 2010, Jill approached the school officials, saying that she was outraged at how her son had been treated, and she proceeded to tell the story, her version of events from the day before. She wrote out what appears to be an affidavit, but I think it was just an unofficial letter that she wrote to the school, and in it, it details her version of events. And she said she found her son crying hysterically. The reason she says her son was so hysterical is because he had been locked out of the school for 19 minutes, and she demanded that they must fire Kelly from this position. Mind you, it is an unpaid volunteer position, but if someone had mistreated a child, I can see asking for their removal, whether it was paid or unpaid. So the school officials did feel like they would at least look into this, and she repeatedly referred to the fact that Kelly called her son slow. And in her letter to the administrators, she is very clear to say that her son is not slow by any standard, and how offended she was, and how malicious that she thought Kelly to be. So she clearly took it as a dig that maybe Kelly was hinting that her son was intellectually slow, or something other than the physical slowness to line up in line with the rest of the children. The director of the ACE program for the region did a bit of an investigation of her own. She interviewed people at the school, she interviewed the Easters as well, and she came to the conclusion that nothing happened to harm the boy, and that the 19-minute wait that his mother described was probably more around the 5-minute wait, and that the harm had been done. Let's move on, and no one was going to be fired or removed from the program. Well, that did not sit well with Jill Easter. She wanted her gone, and she said that. She was very, very vocal about it. She also made sure to let the school officials know that she and her husband were both attorneys, and that neither of them would stand for Kelly working at the school. Jill created a flyer which she passed out to parents and anyone who would take it on the steps of the school, and the school principal told her that this was borderline harassment and that she really needed to not do that. And Jill reminded her that she was well within her rights, that she had a First Amendment right and she was going to exercise it, and she would hand out what she wanted, and that she would also maybe place stickers on her vehicle if she wanted to. She had a lot of creative things to say to the principal. Jill also requested a restraining order against Kelly, citing that she would show up in private areas and was threatening to kill her. I can't help but say that with a smile. I know that's terrible. There are very serious people in the world who legitimately have stalking threats, and this just kind of mocks at that, because it was pretty obvious to me that Kelly was the one that was being harassed. Of course, that's just my opinion. She also said that Kelly was stalking her 6-year-old son, I'm sure in an attempt to have her removed from the school as well. Well, the judge wasn't having that. He threw that out immediately, It didn't have any basis or any weight to it. Then Kent filed a civil suit stating that his son had been, and I want to get this right, he had been the victim of false imprisonment and suffered from extreme and severe mental anguish. So let's hop back 1 year ahead to 2011 and that dreaded scenario for Kelly. So the police smelled a rat, but they could not just drop the charges just because they had a likable suspect. They still had to do their best to figure out exactly what happened and where did those drugs come from. And they decided to start with the phone call that was made. And there was a specific detective that was assigned to handle this, and his name was Andriozzi. So Detective Andriozzi starts listening to this call over and over. He wants to pick up on any little hint or something he may have missed. And he notices a few things. Right off the bat, he notices that the caller sounds nervous, that he starts to stutter a lot during the call. He also gave a lot of detail as though he were reading from a script. And something that I found really interesting when I listened to the call is the fact that he changes his whole demeanor midway through the call. So the dispatcher asks him to spell his name, and he gives her a name that is of Indian origin and immediately starts going into a bad Indian accent. He just went from straight up Irvine, California accent to his attempt at an Indian accent. And so that was a huge, huge red flag. I mean, it's comical to me when I listen to it, but it's so obviously him changing his accent to match the name that he gave the dispatcher. Another thing that was fishy is that the caller knew so much about the school and about Kelly in particular. Instead of just a do-gooder that was trying to help out, he seemed to really know specific details about this school volunteer. The caller claimed that he had a daughter in the school, but when the school records were checked, there was no one by that last name in the school. And to top it all off, the phone number that he gave the dispatcher to get back with him was a fake number. So all around, this call was just terrible. It was the worst call ever. Now, one good thing was that the PD was able to trace the call. And when they did, they found that it came from a hotel, a very posh, kind of swanky hotel in Newport Beach called Island Hotel. And that was a starting point. They had somewhere to look into. It came from a landline in the business office. So naturally, the police department sent the detective to go down to Newport Beach and have a look and see if they could see anything on the footage from that day, specifically around when that call was made. And the officer doesn't recognize anyone on the footage, but they've got the footage, so he says, I'll take it to the school and see what I can find out. So when he shows this to the principal, immediately she says, that looks like Kent Easter. So naturally, the Irvine Police Department is all over it. They've got something to claw into now. This man that made this call, he happens to just have an office right across the way. In fact, his law office, I think, was a few hundred feet away from the Island Hotel. So that was pretty conspicuous right there. They found from the couple's cell records that on the wee hours of the morning, right before that call was made on that very same day, that Jill and Kent had exchanged 15 text messages just in the middle of the night between like 2:30 and 4:30 a.m. Now, I don't know about you, but my husband and I aren't texting at that time. I don't know what it could have been about, but the detectives start to hone in on that a little bit more. They want to get inside those cell phones and see what they can find. Now, Jill's phone pinged off of a tower that was near their home, the Easter's home. And at the same time, Kent's phone was pinging off a tower that was very near Kelly Peters' home. So that doesn't look good for them. So on the morning of March 4th, 2011, as Kent is driving his car to work, Officer Andriozzi and a second officer, they pull Kent over and start to question him. They've got lots they want to know. So they start by asking if he knows Kelly Peters. He says no, he doesn't know her. He's never even seen her face before. The officer told Kent that he had been following him around for some time now. And he said, and I quote, "You gotta ask yourself as an educated man, why in the heck would I be following you around?" And Kent's response was, "I definitely am." Then he asked for a lawyer. No surprise there. But the detective had already gotten a search warrant to search Kent's home and his place of business as well. And they started by searching his vehicle. And the first thing that they notice is some diet pills. And these diet pills are in a easy dose pill pouch that is identical to the pill pouch of the Percocet and the Vicodin that were found in Kelly Peters' vehicle. Next, they searched Kent's office and then his home. As they searched the home, and they seized both of the cell phones, but they would have some problem getting the information out of the cell phones. As Kent and Jill were both attorneys, they went through some legal maneuvering to make sure that those detectives weren't going to get any of the information out of the phones. They cited that it violated the attorney-client privilege for lots of the information in their phones to be known. So earlier that morning, when they were planning their property search for the Easters, they were sitting outside of the Easters' home in, I guess, what you would call a stakeout vehicle. Now, as they sat there plotting the plans for the day, they see a strapping gentleman come walking down the road, and he appears to be going to the Easters' home, and then he spots the officers in the car, and he takes off in the other direction. Now, as he's walking away, he's holding his cell phone to his ear, talking into it, and at the same moment, the officers see Jill. She pops out onto the front porch wearing some type of lingerie. And she then also notices the police officers and ducks back into the house immediately. So the gentleman hops into his vehicle, which is a pickup truck, and the officers immediately pull him over. They want to know more about this guy. Who is this? And they find out he's a firefighter from Los Angeles, and he had come down to visit a woman. Actually, he calls her a girl. He says, "I'm coming to visit a Swedish girl." And he said that her name was Jill. He told police that he had been seeing Jill for 2.5 years, and that he was also married himself, that he and Jill had a very steamy affair. It was very sexual, and he even shared some of their text messages and their exchanges with each other. And also, their phone records would later show very steamy content. They had kind of just a really illicit, naughty kind of affair. Which I guess all affairs are naughty, but you know, they definitely like to talk dirty to each other. Just saying. Just saying. So this man's name was Glenn Gomez, and they warned Glenn about Jill. They said, "She's going to take you down. You're in the middle of something." And without giving him too many details, they kind of asked for his help. He was mainly curious, but he also wanted to prove that He didn't have anything to hide. He wasn't breaking any laws. He just happened to fall in love, as he put it to the officers. And they asked him if he would wear a wire. And he agreed. He said that deep down he really wanted to know what she was up to, because the officers weren't really telling him much. They just knew that she was in the mix of something bad, that she did something that they couldn't share with him. And until you have proof of a thing like that, you wonder. And so I think his mind was wandering a bit. He wanted to know what his Swedish girl was really up to. So when he would press Jill for information, why are cops outside of your house, she would play dumb. And she would be very vague and allude to certain things, but basically she wasn't giving up any information. So one day, Glenn meets with her, and there is footage of it you can find online, where he tells her basically that he thinks that they need to go their separate ways, at least for a while. And I think maybe the reality of what kind of person she was maybe was kicking in at that point. But she, right then and there, accuses him of abandoning her. And he tells her, if you didn't do anything wrong, then you're not going to have anything to worry about. And she says, you're wrong. Like, I have plenty to worry about, and you're abandoning me. And she kind of got more and more pissed off throughout the entire conversation. So Glenn later told police that after this breakup that Jill went crazy, and that's a quote from Glenn. He said she drove all the way to his house in Long Beach, and she brought emails and phone records to show his wife, and she also took it a step further. She wrote a letter and had it sent to his wife's workplace. So she was pretty conniving. So meanwhile, the lab sends back the DNA results, and it is found that both Jill and Kent's DNA is found on the drugs. Now, Jill's DNA was found on 2 of the bags, and Kent's was found on all 3 of the bags. So there's that. So in June of 2012, Kent was dropping his 2 kids off, 2 of his 3 children, at a tennis camp, and then heading into work to his high-rise in Newport Beach when a patrol car pulled him over with an arrest warrant and had his car towed and took him to the county jail. Well, as he's waiting at the county jail to be booked or processed, he looks up and sees that here comes a patrol car with his wife in it as well. She had also been arrested at their home. And although they quickly made bail, as we could expect that they would, right? They were splashed all over the news. Something about this case, like I said, no one was hurt physically, but the pettiness of it and just the degree to which this couple decided to go really struck a chord with people. And so it was all over the news, and kind of a Real Housewives spin on just some sheer pettiness. And the story was out on the streets. And after that, it would never go back to how it was before. And I think people were just fascinated. So if we've learned nothing else from this story, it should be not to be a petty patty. Or maybe the lesson is to lock your cars. I'm going to do more cases like this, though, that seemingly don't have a lot of, a lot of motive, or it's so strange to me how this was such a small thing and someone got that irate and that pissed off at it that it ended up wrecking their lives. They're disbarred and lost everything over such a silly little petty occurrence. But the more I dig, the more cases like this I find. So people can be petty. So if you have any requests or if you know any interesting stories like this, I'd love to hear about it because I'd love to use it. So let me know. And otherwise, I'll see you on the next one.